Hey guys! Tonight we journey into a side of medieval history that's far less romantic than knights rescuing princesses or kings making stirring speeches before battle. Instead, we're looking at a world where empathy was optional, justice was inconsistent, and if someone disappeared on a lonely forest road, well, people generally assumed the wolves had been unusually productive that week. So before you get comfortable, take a moment like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Imagine waking before sunrise in the Middle Ages. Your house is quiet, except for the crackling fire that never quite manages to heat the room. Outside, a rooster proudly announces another day of work, despite contributing absolutely nothing to the local economy besides noise. You pull on rough wool clothes that itch with the determination of 1,000 tiny insects, eat a piece of bread that could double as emergency building material, and prepare for another day in the fields. At first glance, it seems peaceful. Mist drifts over the countryside. Birds chirp in the trees. Somewhere in the distance, church bells echo across the valley. It's the sort of scene that appears on calendars and documentaries narrated by soothing British voices. Then you remember one small detail. If you disappear before sunset, there is a surprisingly good chance nobody will ever find out what happened to you. That isn't meant to be dramatic. It's simply how much of medieval Europe worked. The roads between villages were little more than muddy tracks, winding through enormous forests, marshes and hills. Travellers routinely spent hours completely alone. There were no police patrols, no emergency numbers, no GPS location sharing, and certainly no helpful message saying, "Your cart appears to have stopped moving. Are you still alive?" If you failed to arrive at your destination, your family probably wouldn't panic immediately. Perhaps your horse lost a shoe. Perhaps heavy rain delayed you. Perhaps you found an inn. Perhaps you were eaten by wolves. Medieval people had a remarkably long list of perfectly reasonable explanations before arriving at murder. After several days, neighbours might organise a search. They would walk along the road, ask passing merchants whether they'd seen you, maybe poke around a nearby forest for an afternoon, exchange a few worried looks, and eventually return home because someone still had cows to milk. Life, unfortunately, refused to pause for mysteries, and that uncertainty created extraordinary opportunities for exactly the wrong sort of people. Today, criminals leave fingerprints, DNA, security footage, phone records, bank transactions, internet history, and enough digital evidence to keep forensic specialists happily employed for decades. Modern murder is astonishingly inconvenient. In the Middle Ages, however, nature handled most of the evidence disposal free of charge. Rain washed away footprints, animals scattered remains, woodlands swallowed bodies, rivers carried away clues with admirable efficiency. The forest, it turns out, was history's least cooperative witness. Even record-keeping offered very little help. Many ordinary people never travelled farther than a neighbouring market town during their entire lives. Births, deaths and marriages were recorded inconsistently, if they were recorded at all. If a wandering merchant vanished somewhere between two villages, there might never be an official document proving he had ever existed. Bureaucracy was still in its infancy, and frankly, it wasn't feeling particularly ambitious. Communication made matters even worse. News travelled no faster than the horse carrying it. A murder committed 50 miles away might not be reported for days. One committed 200 miles away might never be connected to anything at all. Villages often knew more about the saints in heaven than the settlements just beyond the next hill. Rumours, of course, travelled much faster. A dragon. Entire county hears about it by Tuesday. An actual murderer? less impressive publicity. Perhaps the greatest advantage for a psychopath was that violence already formed part of everyday life. Disease, famine, accidents, childbirth, warfare, infected cuts, collapsing buildings, and winters that seemed personally offended by humanity killed people constantly. Death wasn't unusual, it was practically a neighbour. When people disappeared so often for perfectly ordinary medieval reasons, another missing traveller rarely inspired a grand investigation. Sometimes there wasn't even anyone important enough to ask questions. Now, this doesn't mean medieval Europe was overflowing with psychopaths lurking behind every tree like particularly unpleasant squirrels. The overwhelming majority of people were decent, hard-working individuals trying to survive difficult lives. They raised families, helped neighbours during harvests, attended church, worried about taxes, and hoped their lord wouldn't invent another excuse to collect them. But for the rare person who felt no empathy, no guilt, and absolutely no remorse, this world was almost perfectly designed for them. Long before forensic science, organised policing, or reliable records existed, the landscape itself became their greatest accomplice. History hadn't intentionally built a paradise for psychopaths. It had simply built a world with very few witnesses, and even fewer people capable of proving what those witnesses had seen. As you continue your journey through the Middle Ages, something begins to feel unsettling. It isn't just the castles looming over the hills or the muddy roads disappearing into dark forests. It's how casually everyone talks about violence. You stop at a village inn after a long day's walk. Over a mug of weak ale, which tastes like someone briefly introduced water to barley before immediately separating them again, you overhear the local conversation. A merchant was robbed on the northern road. 2 neighbouring villages fought over grazing land. A noble hanged 3 poachers yesterday. A miller lost his hand for stealing grain. Someone nods politely and asks whether anyone wants more stew. No one seems particularly shocked. To you, this feels horrifying. To them, it's Tuesday. The medieval world was saturated with violence in a way that's difficult for most modern people to imagine. Wars erupted constantly. Feuds between noble families lasted generations. Executions were public events. Punishments were designed not merely to discourage crime, but to leave an unforgettable impression on everyone watching. If your local lord wanted to demonstrate authority, he didn't issue a strongly worded statement. He built a gallows where everyone could see it. Children grew up watching punishments that would dominate modern news cycles for months. Soldiers returned from campaigns carrying stories that became steadily more gruesome with every cup of ale. Even festivals occasionally included judicial spectacles that attracted crowds almost as large as the market itself. Now, witnessing violence doesn't turn someone into a psychopath. Modern psychology makes that distinction very clear. Most medieval people remained compassionate, despite living in extraordinarily harsh conditions. They mourned loved ones, cared for neighbours, and desperately hoped to avoid conflict whenever possible. But if you already lacked empathy, this environment made you far less noticeable. Imagine a man like Gilles de Rais before his crimes became known. A celebrated knight, wealthy nobleman, and companion of Joan of Arc herself. He was respected, admired, even praised for his courage in battle. In an age where brutality during war was often rewarded, distinguishing between a fearless commander and a deeply disturbed individual wasn't always easy. Or consider Ezzelino da Romano in northern Italy, whose reputation for ruthless cruelty became legendary even among his contemporaries. Chroniclers accused him of imprisoning, torturing, and executing enemies with remarkable enthusiasm. Medieval writers, who were hardly delicate souls themselves, described him with genuine horror. That's usually a sign someone has exceeded the acceptable daily allowance of brutality. Then there was King John of England. Even centuries later, historians still debate exactly how cruel he truly was. But one story persisted stubbornly through medieval chronicles, that he starved prisoners to death in their own cells. Whether every detail is accurate or not, the tale survived because people found it believable. His reputation had earned that distinction. Perhaps the strangest part is that cruelty could become ordinary through repetition. When executions happened regularly, another hanging attracted less attention. When wars devastated entire regions every decade, another burned village became yesterday's news. When disease killed half your neighbours before winter ended, human life inevitably seemed more fragile and sometimes, tragically, less valuable. For a psychopath, this wasn't paradise because everyone else was cruel. It was paradise because genuine cruelty blended into a world where suffering had already become painfully familiar. Like a wolf wandering unnoticed among barking dogs, the truly dangerous individual could hide in plain sight, wearing the same muddy boots as everyone else. By now, you've probably reached an uncomfortable conclusion. The forests are dangerous, the roads are dangerous, disease is dangerous. But perhaps the most dangerous place in medieval Europe is standing in the way of the wrong noble. In theory, everyone answered to the law. In practice, the law often answered to whoever owned the biggest castle. You arrive at the estate of a powerful lord. Let's call him Lord Geoffrey, not because every Geoffrey was terrifying, but because statistically, at least one Geoffrey has caused problems in every century. His castle overlooks several villages. Hundreds of peasants work his land. He collects taxes, settles disputes, commands soldiers, and decides who deserves punishment. He is, for all practical purposes, the government. If Geoffrey is fair, life is difficult but manageable. If Geoffrey happens to be cruel, selfish, or completely devoid of empathy, well, congratulations. You've just lost the medieval lottery. Feudal society placed enormous authority into the hands of local lords. Kings technically ruled kingdoms, but they couldn't personally supervise thousands of castles scattered across mountains, forests, and rivers. Communication was slow. Royal officials were few. Many nobles governed their territories with remarkable independence. That meant personality mattered. A compassionate lord could reduce taxes after a poor harvest. A greedy one might raise them anyway. A wise lord settled disputes peacefully. A vicious one settled them permanently. History gives us plenty of examples. Take Gilles de Rais, one of France's richest nobles during the 15th century. He fought alongside Joan of Arc, earned enormous prestige, and possessed wealth beyond imagination. His rank protected him for years. Servants disappeared. Rumours spread. Parents whispered warnings. Yet few dared openly accuse a man whose influence reached across entire provinces. Or consider Vlad the Impaler. Modern culture often turns him into a vampire legend, but his real methods hardly required fictional improvements. Vlad used impalement not simply as punishment, but as psychological warfare. Forests of impaled bodies greeted invading armies. Whether every chronicler exaggerated is still debated, but even allowing for medieval storytelling, his reputation terrified Europe. Power amplified cruelty. When ordinary criminals committed murder, they hid the body. When powerful rulers committed murder, they sometimes displayed it publicly, because they wanted everyone else to notice. And perhaps that's the greatest difference. Psychopaths often seek control. They enjoy domination more than simple violence. Medieval nobility provided exactly the tools they needed. Absolute authority over tenants, armed retainers willing to obey questionable orders, private prisons, and enough wealth to silence inconvenient witnesses. Imagine being a peasant whose daughter disappears after working at the castle. Who do you accuse? The lord? His captain? His steward? On what evidence? Even if everyone in the village suspected the truth, suspicion was not proof. Accusing a noble without evidence could easily become your final mistake. Medieval justice had an unfortunate tendency to investigate the accuser instead. Of course, not every noble abused power. Far from it. Many genuinely protected their lands, defended their people, funded monasteries, and took their responsibilities seriously. Medieval chronicles praise countless rulers for their generosity and fairness. But when an individual without empathy inherited enormous power, the system offered remarkably few safeguards. Today, we worry about dangerous people gaining authority. In the Middle Ages, authority sometimes came first. Then everyone simply hoped the person inheriting it possessed something as inconvenient as a conscience. The castle on the hill looks magnificent from a distance. Stone walls, towering battlements, colourful banners fluttering in the wind. If you've watched enough movies, you're probably expecting noble banquets, heroic speeches, and perhaps a wise old king stroking an impressive beard. Then you actually walk through the front gate. The smell hits first. Despite what Hollywood might suggest, castles weren't exactly medieval spas. Hundreds of people, dozens of animals, open fires, overflowing latrines, and very questionable plumbing created an aroma best described as historically authentic. You immediately understand why everyone carried herbs or flowers to smell during dinner. They weren't being romantic. They were surviving. But unpleasant smells weren't the real danger. The real danger was that once those gates closed behind you, you had entered someone else's world. A medieval castle wasn't simply a home. It was a fortress, a courthouse, a prison, a military headquarters, and the centre of local government, all rolled into one. If you lived on the surrounding lands, the lord inside those walls controlled nearly every aspect of your life. And if that lord happened to be compassionate, everyone benefited. If he happened to be a psychopath, the castle became his laboratory. Take Peter Neers, a notorious German criminal of the late 16th century. Although not a noble himself, he survived for years, partly because local authorities rarely cooperated with one another. Every territory had different rulers, different courts, and different priorities. Cross one border, and suddenly yesterday's wanted man became today's complete stranger. Now imagine someone with that same lack of empathy, but also born into wealth and authority. You wouldn't need to flee. People came to you. Castles often contained private prisons beneath their towers. Some prisoners were legitimate criminals awaiting trial or ransom. Others simply had the misfortune of angering the wrong lord. Once inside those thick stone walls, very few outsiders knew exactly what happened below ground. There were no surprise inspections, no independent investigators, certainly no anonymous complaints department. If your cell happened to have poor customer service, there wasn't another castle you could leave a negative review on. One infamous example was Countess Elizabeth Bathory. Although she lived slightly after the traditional Middle Ages, her story perfectly illustrates what enormous wealth and isolation could allow. According to later investigations, numerous servant girls disappeared while working in her castles. Some accounts claim she tortured and murdered dozens, perhaps even hundreds. Modern historians debate the numbers and some details, but one fact remains undeniable. Her social status delayed serious action for years. Power created silence. Servants depended upon their lord for food and wages. Soldiers depended upon him for employment. Priests often relied on noble donations. Neighbours feared retaliation. Even when rumours spread, proving anything inside a private castle was extraordinarily difficult, and rumours certainly flourished. People whispered about hidden chambers, secret tunnels, prisoners who never emerged, and banquets where certain guests mysteriously failed to return home. Most of these tales were exaggerated. Medieval people loved dramatic storytelling almost as much as modern people enjoy internet conspiracy theories. But every so often, the rumours turned out to be true, because behind those magnificent stone walls, some castles weren't simply protecting kingdoms, they were protecting monsters. Eventually, you decide you've spent enough time inside castles. Fresh air sounds appealing. Unfortunately, so does your coin purse. You leave the safety of the town shortly after dawn, joining a handful of merchants heading toward the next market. The road stretches for miles through forests and rolling hills. It isn't paved, it isn't guarded, and judging by the nervous expressions on everyone's faces, it certainly isn't trusted. Nobody walks alone if they can help it, not because medieval people enjoyed company. Because being alone dramatically increased your chances of becoming someone else's afternoon activity. The medieval road network was the perfect hunting ground. Merchants carried silver, pilgrims carried donations, messengers carried valuable documents, travellers carried food, clothing, horses, and occasionally enough money to make murder seem like a reasonable business decision. There were no highway patrols, no police checkpoints, no emergency telephones every few miles. If someone stepped out of the trees holding a sword, your customer support options were disappointingly limited. Banditry wasn't simply random crime. In many regions, it became an industry. Some gangs watched important trade routes for weeks, learning exactly when merchants travelled and how many guards accompanied them. Others received information from dishonest innkeepers or corrupt officials. By the time victims realised they were being followed, escape was often impossible. One particularly famous example was the robber knight. Yes, that was an actual profession. Across the Holy Roman Empire, certain impoverished nobles discovered they could make far more money robbing merchants than collecting lawful taxes. Men like Hans Thomas von Habsburg became notorious during the early 16th century, attacking caravans, kidnapping wealthy travellers, and demanding enormous ransoms. He wasn't hiding in caves like a fairy tale outlaw. He owned castles, which made filing complaints somewhat awkward. Imagine arriving breathless at the nearest town. "I've just been robbed!" Terrible news. Who did it? Sir Hans. The knight who owns the castle over there. Yes. Oh, that conversation rarely ended with immediate justice. Even ordinary bandits understood something that modern criminologists still recognise today. Fear travels faster than violence. If one caravan escaped to tell horrifying stories, 10 future caravans might surrender without resistance. Reputation became a weapon all by itself. Some gangs deliberately left survivors alive for exactly that reason. It was excellent advertising. Meanwhile, local rulers often struggled to respond. Their authority ended at borders. A gang could rob travellers in one territory, cross into another by sunset, and suddenly become someone else's problem. Sound familiar? Jurisdiction has been giving law enforcement headaches for centuries. Of course, countless honest people travelled these same roads every day. Most merchants completed their journeys successfully. Most pilgrims reached their shrines. Medieval Europe wasn't one endless ambush, but for a psychopath who enjoyed intimidation, violence, and complete control over helpless strangers. The roads offered endless opportunity. Out there beneath the trees, surrounded by silence, there were no witnesses. Only victims waiting to round the next bend. After surviving the roads, you eventually stumble across an army preparing to march. You expect discipline, honour, perhaps a stirring speech about protecting the kingdom. Instead, you find 3 soldiers arguing over whose turn it is to steal the cooking pot. Welcome to medieval warfare. Kings love talking about glory. The men actually doing the fighting were often more interested in surviving long enough to collect their pay. Or someone else's pay. During the Middle Ages, armies weren't always made up of loyal subjects eager to defend their homeland. Many were filled with mercenaries, professional soldiers who fought for whoever offered the highest wage. Today they might wear one kingdom's colours. Next year, if another lord paid better, they'd happily switch sides. Medieval LinkedIn was remarkably straightforward. For most mercenaries, this wasn't immoral. It was employment. After all, farming depended on the weather. Blacksmithing required expensive tools. Fighting simply required surviving yesterday. But war had a habit of attracting a certain type of person. Imagine someone who enjoys violence, feels little empathy, and has no particular attachment to home or community. In peaceful times, that personality stands out. In wartime, he might earn a promotion. The English free companies that roamed France during the 100 Years' War became infamous for exactly this reason. When temporary truces interrupted the fighting, thousands of armed soldiers suddenly found themselves unemployed. Unfortunately, they remained fully equipped. Rather than returning peacefully to civilian life, many simply continued doing what they knew best. They looted villages, kidnapped wealthy travellers, extorted towns, burned farms that refused to pay protection money. Apparently, unemployment benefits looked very different in the 14th century. One of the most notorious leaders was Sir Robert Knowles. An exceptionally talented English commander, he also gained a fearsome reputation across France as his troops devastated the countryside during military campaigns. To English chroniclers, he was a brilliant captain. To French peasants, the reviews were considerably less enthusiastic. Then there were the infamous routiers, roaming companies of unemployed soldiers who wandered across France almost like heavily armed freelance disasters. Peace treaties often frightened villagers more than wars themselves, because peace meant thousands of professional fighters suddenly needed new income. Guess where that income usually came from? Not everyone wearing armour behaved this way, of course. Many knights genuinely followed ideals of honour, protected civilians when possible, and remained deeply religious. Medieval chronicles celebrate countless examples of courage, restraint, and generosity. But for the rare psychopath, war offered something unique. Violence became legal. Killing became expected. Cruelty could even earn admiration if directed toward the enemy. The line separating military necessity from personal sadism often became dangerously blurred. After all, if everyone around you is setting villages on fire, it's surprisingly easy for one man to enjoy it a little more than everyone else. Not every psychopath in the Middle Ages carried a sword. Some carried a Bible. Others carried a doctor's bag. A few simply carried enough confidence to convince everyone else they knew what they were talking about. As you continue your journey, you arrive in a bustling market town. Merchants shout prices. Blacksmiths hammer glowing iron. Children chase chickens that have absolutely no interest in being caught. In the middle of the square, a crowd gathers around a well-dressed stranger. He claims to possess a tiny fragment of the true cross. As your journey continues, you quickly notice that religion is everywhere. Church bells decide when the day begins. Saints' feast days determine the calendar. Before eating, people pray. Before travelling, they pray. Before going into battle, they pray. After surviving the battle, they pray even harder. Faith is woven into every corner of medieval life, and for millions of people, it provides genuine comfort. The local priest baptizes children, blesses marriages, buries the dead, settles disputes, and reminds everyone that eternal life is hopefully less complicated than this one. Most members of the clergy take these responsibilities seriously, but enormous trust is like a chest full of gold. Eventually, someone tries to steal it. For a psychopath, religion offers something incredibly powerful, authority that few people dare question. Imagine arriving in a village where everyone believes that God speaks through a particular holy man. If he tells them the harvest will fail unless they donate money, who argues? If he accuses someone of secretly serving the devil, who wants to defend the accused and risk looking suspicious themselves? Fear is persuasive. Fear mixed with eternal damnation is even better. You might meet a wandering preacher who claims to have received visions from heaven. His sermons are dramatic. He predicts disasters. He identifies hidden sinners. Somehow, the solution always seems to involve people giving him food, shelter, horses, or generous donations. Quite a remarkable coincidence. History offers fascinating examples. Take Brother Raniero Fasani in 13th century Italy. His movement of flagellants inspired thousands of people to march through towns whipping themselves in public, believing extreme penance would persuade God to spare humanity from disaster. Raniero himself appears to have been sincere, but his movement demonstrates just how quickly charismatic figures could influence enormous crowds. Now imagine someone equally charismatic, but completely lacking a conscience. The possibilities become unsettling. During times of plague, famine, or war, frightened communities desperately searched for explanations. If a manipulative leader pointed toward an outsider, a widow, a traveller, or an unpopular neighbour and declared, "There is the reason God is punishing us," panic could spread astonishingly fast. Evidence became optional. Confidence became everything. Even kings weren't immune. Throughout medieval Europe, rulers frequently sought advice from astrologers, prophets, mystics, and supposedly holy visionaries. Some advisors genuinely believed they possessed divine insight. Others simply possessed excellent acting skills. The difference wasn't always obvious. Of course, the medieval church also produced remarkable individuals who protected the poor, founded hospitals, preserved ancient knowledge, and challenged corrupt rulers. Many bishops and abbots risked their own lives defending innocent people against violence. But psychopaths rarely invent trust. They borrow it. And in the Middle Ages, few things inspired greater trust than religion. A sword could force obedience for a day. A convincing claim to speak for God could command obedience for an entire lifetime. For someone without empathy, that was a far more powerful weapon than steel ever could be. By now, you've survived corrupt nobles, murderous roads, mercenaries, and enough suspicious holy men to become politely skeptical of anyone claiming to possess a miracle in their backpack. But now, you encounter an even stranger problem. No one realizes they're hunting a serial killer. Not because medieval people were foolish, because the very idea barely existed. Imagine you're a sheriff in a small English town. A traveller disappears on the northern road. Tragic, certainly, but travellers disappear all the time. A month later, another merchant vanishes 50 miles away. Then a young servant fails to arrive at a neighbouring village. Then a pilgrim is found dead beside a river. To you, these seem like unrelated misfortunes. To a modern detective, alarm bells would be ringing loud enough to wake the entire kingdom. Today, investigators compare fingerprints, DNA, phone records, surveillance footage, financial transactions, and databases containing millions of names. Police departments communicate across regions and countries almost instantly. The Middle Ages had a horse. Sometimes. If the horse wasn't lame. Communication between towns was painfully slow. Each village dealt with its own problems. Local officials rarely exchanged detailed reports, and there was certainly no central office collecting information about unusual murders across an entire kingdom. As far as one town knew, they had suffered a single mysterious death. They had no idea 3 neighbouring villages were saying exactly the same thing. This allowed certain killers to move almost invisibly. One remarkable example is Peter Neers, active in 16th century Germany. Although he technically lived just after the Middle Ages, his world still functioned in many medieval ways. Neers wandered from town to town disguised as a shepherd, labourer, or merchant. According to contemporary accounts, he was linked to dozens of murders, although some later stories almost certainly exaggerated his crimes into legend. Still, one fact remains undeniable. He operated for years. Every time suspicion grew in one region, he simply moved elsewhere. A new town, new victims, new people who had never heard his name. The pattern started all over again. Then there is Gilles de Rais, whose horrifying crimes against children remained hidden behind wealth and noble privilege for years before investigations finally exposed him. Servants whispered, families worried, children disappeared, but isolated rumours rarely formed a complete picture. No one possessed the information to connect every piece together. Psychopaths understand something timeless. People struggle to recognise patterns they cannot see. If each witness observes only one small fragment, nobody realises they're looking at the same puzzle. Ironically, medieval superstition sometimes made investigations even harder. A body discovered in the forest might be blamed on wolves, or demons, or witches, or divine punishment. To be fair, wolves actually were responsible surprisingly often, which made solving murders considerably more complicated. When nature and criminals shared similar hobbies, confusion was inevitable. The overwhelming majority of medieval murders were committed for ordinary reasons: revenge, robbery, inheritance, drunken arguments, or political conflict. True serial killers were exceptionally rare, but when one did appear, the medieval world was almost perfectly designed to help him disappear, not because people failed to care, because they simply lacked the tools to realise that somewhere, beyond the next forest and the next village, the same monster was quietly repeating the same crime. At this point you might be wondering something. If everyone knew who the cruel lord was, if everyone feared the violent mercenary, if everyone whispered about the suspicious noble whose servants kept disappearing, why didn't they simply stop him? The answer is both frustrating and surprisingly simple, because they usually couldn't. You wake one morning in your small medieval village. Your family has lived here for generations. You farm land that technically doesn't belong to you. Your house belongs to your lord. The mill where you grind your grain belongs to your lord. The forest where you gather firewood belongs to your lord. Even the oven where you bake your bread might belong to your lord. At this point, you're beginning to suspect the chickens are paying him rent as well. Your entire life depends on remaining in his good graces. If he doubles your taxes, you pay. If he orders you to repair castle walls, you obey. If he summons you for military service, you grab a spear and hope someone else gets hit first. Openly accusing that same lord of murder requires a level of courage bordering on professional suicide. The legal system offered very little protection for ordinary people. Justice wasn't blind. Quite often it was simply looking in the direction of whoever had the most soldiers. Suppose your brother disappears after delivering grain to the castle. Everyone in the village quietly suspects something terrible happened. Nobody says it aloud. Why? Because accusations require evidence. Evidence requires witnesses. And witnesses generally enjoy remaining alive. Even if a complaint somehow reached the king, the journey itself might take weeks. The messenger needed money, transportation, and permission to travel. By the time royal officials finally arrived, assuming they arrived at all, the evidence had vanished, memories had faded, and every important witness had suddenly remembered another appointment. Usually somewhere very far away. Fear has an interesting effect on communities. It doesn't always make people panic. More often it teaches them silence. Parents warned children not to ask certain questions. Neighbours learned when to look the other way. Servants became experts at pretending they hadn't seen anything unusual. After all, seeing too much could become extremely unhealthy. History is full of examples. The crimes of Gilles de Rais didn't remain hidden because everyone believed he was innocent. Rumours circulated for years. Families whispered. Servants suspected. People talked quietly behind closed doors, but whispers are not enough to arrest one of the richest men in France. Power creates hesitation, and hesitation buys dangerous people time. This wasn't cowardice. It was survival. Most medieval families worried far more about feeding their children through the winter than becoming heroes in someone else's criminal investigation. Standing up to a psychopath sounds admirable. Standing up to a psychopath who also owns the castle, commands 50 armed men, controls your livelihood, and has the judge eating dinner at his table every Thursday. That's considerably more complicated. For most ordinary people, courage wasn't the problem. Opportunity was. And that may have been the greatest advantage psychopaths enjoyed throughout the Middle Ages. They didn't simply rely on fear. They relied on a society where almost everyone had something far more valuable than justice to lose. If you've made it this far through the Middle Ages without being robbed, imprisoned, accused of witchcraft, or forced to kiss a suspiciously large fragment of the true cross, congratulations. You're already doing better than many fictional peasants. But history has a habit of changing, even if it does so at the speed of an elderly mule climbing a hill. By the late Middle Ages, rulers across Europe had begun noticing an inconvenient problem. Too many local lords were behaving like miniature kings. Bandits were disrupting trade. Mercenary companies were devastating entire regions. Corruption was becoming expensive, and kings dislike many things, but they especially dislike losing tax revenue. As kingdoms slowly became more centralized, monarchs began extending their authority into places that had previously governed themselves. Royal judges travelled farther. Written laws became more consistent. Officials started keeping better records of land ownership, legal disputes, and criminal cases. It wasn't modern policing, but it was a beginning. Imagine you're a murderer operating in the year 1200. You kill someone in one county. The local lord investigates, assuming he feels particularly energetic that week. Now imagine trying the same thing 200 years later. Suddenly, royal courts are asking questions. Sheriffs communicate more regularly. Documents survive longer. Witnesses are questioned more carefully. Life is becoming inconvenient. One of the greatest weapons against psychopaths wasn't sharper swords. It was paperwork, an astonishingly boring invention, but an incredibly effective one. The English crown, for example, gradually expanded institutions like the King's Bench and itinerant justices who travelled across the kingdom hearing criminal cases. Instead of every lord interpreting justice however he pleased, More disputes slowly came under royal supervision. That didn't eliminate corruption. It simply meant corruption occasionally had to fill out forms. Cities were changing too. Growing medieval towns established night watches, organised guilds, and stricter local regulations. Gates closed after dark. Strangers attracted more attention. Merchants demanded safer streets because commerce functions much better when customers aren't regularly murdered on the way to market. An unexpectedly reasonable business strategy. Even universities contributed in surprising ways. As educated lawyers became more common, legal arguments relied increasingly on written evidence rather than simply asking whichever noble looked the angriest. Progress was slow. Painfully slow. Sometimes generations passed before reforms reached distant villages. Some regions remained violent for centuries, others improved much faster. History rarely moves in straight lines. Psychopaths, of course, didn't disappear. They adapted. Instead of relying purely on brute force, many learned to manipulate courts, politics, finances, and religion more skillfully than before. Because while society was becoming more organised, human nature remained stubbornly familiar. Still, the walls were slowly closing in. Not with chains, not with armies, but with something psychopaths have always hated: accountability. For the first time in centuries, the medieval world was beginning to realise that justice worked far better when it belonged to the kingdom, rather than whichever Geoffrey happened to own the nearest castle. After everything you've seen, it's tempting to reach one simple conclusion. The Middle Ages must have been overflowing with psychopaths, cruel lords, merciless bandits, sadistic mercenaries, manipulative frauds. Surely people back then were simply more violent than we are today. Oddly enough, probably not. The human brain hasn't changed very much in the last 1,000 years. Modern psychologists generally estimate that a small percentage of the population displays significant psychopathic traits today, and there is little reason to believe medieval Europe was somehow producing dramatically more of them. The difference wasn't the number, it was the opportunity. Imagine taking the exact same individual, a person who feels no guilt, no empathy, and views other human beings merely as useful tools. Place him in a modern city. His movements are recorded by cameras. His purchases leave digital trails. His phone constantly announces where he has been. His DNA can betray him decades after a crime. Witnesses can contact police within seconds. Even buying a loaf of bread often leaves an electronic receipt. Frankly, it's a difficult century to get away with anything. Now place that same person in the year 1300. No cameras, no fingerprints, no criminal databases, no national police, no reliable identity documents. If he changes his name after travelling 50 miles, chances are nobody questions it. He can simply become someone else. History is filled with examples of people doing exactly that. A wandering labourer arrives in town. No one knows where he came from. A travelling merchant claims to have worked in France. Perhaps he did. Perhaps he invented the entire story during breakfast. Who's going to verify it? Certainly not Geoffrey from the tax office. Geoffrey hasn't been invented yet. Even reputation had limits. A dangerous individual could flee one region after attracting suspicion and start over somewhere entirely new. New neighbours, new employer, new victims. The past was remarkably easy to escape. Modern society makes reinvention considerably more complicated. Banks ask questions. Governments ask questions. Airports ask many, many questions. The Middle Ages mostly asked whether you could swing a hammer or harvest wheat. If the answer was yes, people were generally satisfied. This is why historians urge caution when discussing medieval cruelty. Most violence came from ordinary motives: war, politics, greed, revenge, survival, or desperation. True psychopaths remained rare. What made the Middle Ages unusual was that society accidentally removed many of the obstacles that normally limited them. A cruel noble inherited power. A manipulative preacher inherited trust. A violent mercenary inherited war. A clever killer inherited anonymity. The system wasn't designed to protect psychopaths. It simply wasn't designed to stop them. And perhaps that's the most uncomfortable lesson of all. Civilization doesn't eliminate dangerous people. It gradually removes the opportunities that allow them to flourish. When those safeguards disappear, history has shown, again and again, just how quickly the wrong people learn to take advantage of the silence. As dawn breaks on your final morning in the Middle Ages, you look back on everything you've witnessed: the lonely roads, the towering castles, the ruthless nobles, the corrupt officials, the mercenaries who treated villages like walking wallets, the frauds who sold hope by the handful. And through it all, one question keeps returning. Was the Middle Ages really a paradise for psychopaths? In many ways, yes. Not because medieval people were crueler than we are, not because Europe was somehow filled with monsters, but because the world itself unintentionally rewarded the qualities psychopaths already possessed: a lack of empathy, fearlessness, charm when necessary, violence when useful, manipulation whenever violence wasn't required. Most people depend on trust to build a life. Psychopaths often depend on exploiting trust instead. The Middle Ages simply made that much easier. As Europe gradually entered the Renaissance and later the early modern world, society began changing in ways that few people noticed at first. Roads became busier, cities grew larger, governments became stronger, courts became more organised. Written records became increasingly common. Suddenly disappearing into another province wasn't quite as simple as changing your name from William to slightly different William. Officials began comparing documents. Merchants carried letters of introduction. Church records expanded. Royal governments demanded more information about their subjects. It sounds terribly boring. To psychopaths, it was absolutely dreadful. Every new record created another thread connecting people to their past. Every census made anonymity harder. Every court reduced the power of private revenge. Every royal official limited the authority of cruel local lords. Civilization wasn't becoming perfect. It was becoming interconnected, and interconnected societies are much harder to manipulate. That doesn't mean dangerous people disappeared. History after the Middle Ages remains filled with dictators, serial killers, corrupt politicians, war criminals, and con artists who would have felt perfectly at home in any medieval castle. Human nature never received a software update. The difference is that modern societies have built layer after layer of obstacles. Police, forensic science, independent courts, journalists, banks, identity documents, communication that travels across continents in seconds instead of weeks. None of these systems catch every criminal. None are flawless. But together, they make life considerably more difficult for someone hoping to terrorize an entire region unnoticed. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson the Middle Ages leave behind. Psychopaths do not create broken systems. They discover them. They identify weaknesses that everyone else ignores. Then they quietly turn those weaknesses into opportunities. The ordinary people you've met throughout this journey were never the problem. They farmed, traded, raised children, cared for neighbours, prayed, laughed, and somehow found reasons to celebrate despite living through incredibly difficult times. The monsters were always the exception. History simply reminds us that when institutions are weak, accountability disappears and fear becomes ordinary. exceptions suddenly become far more dangerous. And thankfully, unlike your medieval journey, tonight you can simply turn off the video, lock your front door, and enjoy the comforting knowledge that if Geoffrey from the castle starts acting suspiciously, someone will probably check his search history first. As your journey through the Middle Ages draws toward its end, one final thought settles in. The names you've heard throughout this video, Gilles de Rais, Ezelino da Romano, Elizabeth Bathory, Peter Nears, survived because history remembered them. But what about the ones it didn't? For every infamous noble whose crimes filled medieval chronicles, there were probably dozens of ordinary predators whose names disappeared forever. Imagine a small village somewhere in Burgundy, or Saxony, or the Scottish Highlands. The year hardly matters. A young woman leaves before dawn to gather firewood. She never comes home. Her family searches the nearby woods. Neighbours volunteer to help. The local priest offers prayers. After several days, people reluctantly accept that she is gone. Perhaps wolves, perhaps bandits. Perhaps she slipped into the river. Life has to continue. The harvest won't wait for grief. Now imagine that none of those explanations are true. Imagine instead that someone in the village knows exactly what happened. A respected craftsman, a prosperous farmer, a travelling merchant staying at the inn, someone who smiles politely every Sunday during Mass, someone who helps repair the church roof, someone everyone trusts. History never learns his name. Neither do we. That is perhaps the most unsettling reality of medieval crime. History overwhelmingly records extraordinary people, kings, queens, bishops, generals, the wealthy, the notorious. Ordinary victims rarely left written records. Ordinary criminals left even fewer. If a local killer murdered 3 travellers over 20 years and died peacefully in his own bed, there is an excellent chance he vanished from history entirely. No trial, no confession, no chronicle, no documentary narrated 8 centuries later. Just silence. Even medieval chroniclers had priorities. If a king invaded another kingdom, they wrote pages about it. If a peasant named Thomas mysteriously disappeared somewhere outside York, Thomas was unlikely to receive his own chapter. Harsh, certainly, but parchment was expensive. Modern historians constantly face this problem. The surviving documents were usually written by educated clergy, royal officials, or wealthy nobles. Their interests shaped the historical record. Wars, treaties, coronations, and miracles seemed worthy of preserving. Missing Shepherd, number 37. Less so. That means the medieval world we study today is only a fragment of the one that actually existed. Imagine living in a place where winter seems determined to outlast your patience. The sun disappears for weeks, the sea freezes in places, and your neighbours occasionally sail away to raid another kingdom instead of borrowing a cup of flour. Welcome to Viking Age Scandinavia, where festivals were not simply pleasant interruptions to ordinary life. They were essential. Without them, the endless cycle of farming, fishing, surviving, and hoping the weather showed at least a little mercy would have become almost unbearable. For the Vikings, there was no clear line separating religion, family, politics, and entertainment. Everything blended together. A feast honoured the gods, strengthened friendships, settled disputes, displayed wealth, arranged marriages, and reminded everyone that life could still be enjoyable, despite the constant possibility of famine or a spectacularly inconvenient snowstorm. The Norse divided the year according to nature, rather than a neatly printed calendar. Every season brought its own responsibilities, and every major transition deserved recognition. Spring meant preparing the fields, and hoping fertility would bless both crops and livestock. Summer offered long days for trade, exploration, and warfare. Autumn became the season of harvest and preparation. Then came winter, when darkness settled over Scandinavia like an uninvited guest who refused to leave. These seasonal changes shaped nearly every festival the Vikings celebrated. Their ceremonies followed the rhythm of the land because their survival depended upon it. If the harvest failed, people starved. If livestock died, entire communities suffered. Good weather was not simply appreciated. It was a matter of life and death. Naturally, asking the gods for assistance became something of an annual tradition. The gods themselves played an active role in these celebrations. Odin promised wisdom and victory. Thor protected farms from giants and storms. Freya oversaw fertility and abundant harvests. Freya watched over love, prosperity, and the mysteries surrounding life and death. Every festival became an opportunity to strengthen the relationship between humans and these powerful beings through sacrifices, prayers, music, and perhaps most famously, enormous quantities of ale. Feasting also carried social importance. Viking chieftains demonstrated their generosity by providing food and drink for everyone under their protection. A leader who hosted magnificent celebrations gained prestige, loyalty, and political influence. A stingy chieftain, on the other hand, quickly earned a reputation almost as dangerous as cowardice. Nothing undermines leadership quite like serving watered-down ale to guests who travelled for days. These gatherings united entire communities. Families reunited after months apart. Traders exchanged news from distant lands. Poets recited heroic tales that grew slightly more impressive with every retelling. Laws were discussed, marriages arranged, disagreements settled, and occasionally new arguments started before dessert had even arrived. So while modern holidays often revolve around vacations or discounted shopping, Viking festivals revolved around something much simpler and far more important: surviving another year together. Every celebration marked another victory over nature itself, a reminder that despite the cold, the uncertainty, and the occasional dragon carved into someone's longship, life was still worth raising another drinking horn to. Now that you have survived the endless chores of a Viking year, winter finally arrives. The fields are frozen, the livestock have been brought into shelter, the fishing becomes unpredictable, and daylight has become little more than a rumour. Fortunately, this is exactly when the Vikings celebrated their greatest festival, Jol, better known today as Yule. Unlike modern Christmas, where arguments about wrapping paper somehow become family traditions, Yule carried enormous religious importance. It marked the middle of winter, when the nights were longest and the return of the sun still felt uncertain. For people who depended entirely on nature, those long weeks of darkness could be unsettling. Every sunrise that followed became a small victory. The celebration usually lasted several days, although wealthy chieftains sometimes stretched it much longer. Hospitality became almost sacred. Longhouses filled with relatives, neighbours, travellers, and anyone fortunate enough to receive an invitation. Fires burned continuously inside the hall, casting flickering light across carved wooden pillars while snow piled silently outside. Food appeared in astonishing quantities. This was no ordinary meal. Families slaughtered animals they had carefully raised throughout the year, especially pigs, whose meat symbolized abundance and prosperity. Large joints of roasted pork covered the tables alongside smoked fish, venison, bread, butter, cheese, dried berries, nuts, and whatever precious supplies had survived the autumn. After months of careful rationing, people finally allowed themselves to eat generously. Of course, no Viking feast was complete without ale. Brewing enough beer for Yule was practically a legal obligation in parts of medieval Scandinavia. Every household was expected to contribute. Drinking together was not simply entertainment. It reinforced friendships, settled disputes, and honoured both the living and the dead. Toasts were offered to Odin for wisdom and victory, to Njord for prosperity at sea, and to Freyr for fertile fields in the coming year. One particularly famous tradition involved the ceremonial boar. Freyr's sacred animal represented fertility and good fortune. During some celebrations, participants placed their hands upon a living boar and swore important oaths for the coming year. Considering Vikings took promises extremely seriously, choosing your words carefully was probably wiser than making ambitious New Year's resolutions after several drinking horns. Yule also belonged to Odin in another remarkable way. According to Norse belief, the Allfather rode across the winter sky during this season, leading the terrifying wild hunt. Accompanied by ghostly warriors, spirits, and supernatural creatures, Odin swept through the dark forests searching for souls. Many people stayed indoors, believing it unwise to cross paths with the procession. Meeting Odin unexpectedly was rarely considered good for one's long-term health. Evergreen branches decorated homes because they remained alive when everything else appeared dead. Great logs burned in the hearth for days, providing warmth and symbolizing endurance through the harsh season. Gift-giving also existed, though usually as practical exchanges or rewards from generous chieftains, rather than neatly wrapped packages waiting beneath a tree. When Christianity gradually spread across Scandinavia, many of these customs proved too beloved to disappear. Instead, they quietly transformed. Yule became Christmas. Evergreen decorations remained. Feasting continued. Toasts became less devoted to Odin and rather more focused on Christ. Even the name Yule survived in many northern languages. So while today's holiday season may feature electric lights and shopping lists instead of sacrificial feasts and ghostly hunts, its roots stretch deep into Viking winter, where surviving the darkest nights together was reason enough for the greatest celebration of the entire year. As winter slowly loosened its grip and the promise of spring crept back into Scandinavia, another important festival arrived. Unlike the thunderous feasting of Yule, this celebration carried a quieter, more mysterious atmosphere. It was called Disseblot, a festival dedicated not to the famous gods like Thor or Odin, but to the Disir, powerful female spirits believed to watch over families, homes, and entire bloodlines. Exactly who the Disir were remains one of the great puzzles of Norse religion. The Vikings themselves probably would not have agreed on a single answer. Some believed they were ancestral women who continued protecting their descendants after death. Others thought they were divine female beings connected to fertility and destiny. Still others saw them as something in between. The Norse had an impressive talent for allowing supernatural categories to overlap, until everyone simply nodded and accepted that reality was complicated. Whatever their true nature, the Disir commanded respect. Unlike many public Viking festivals, Disseblot often centred on the household rather than the entire community. Families gathered together to honour the women who had shaped their lineage, whether they remained alive or had long since entered the world beyond. In Viking society, ancestry mattered enormously. A person's family determined alliances, inheritance, reputation, and sometimes whether neighbours greeted you warmly or reached for an axe first. Women occupied a surprisingly influential place within these ceremonies. While Viking society remained largely patriarchal in matters of warfare and politics, women frequently oversaw domestic religion. The lady of the household cared for family shrines, safeguarded sacred objects, and performed rituals connected with prosperity and fertility. keys hanging from a woman's belt symbolised more than ownership of the house. They represented responsibility for the family's well-being, both practical and spiritual. Offerings during Disablot reflected these hopes. Ale, bread, meat, butter, and carefully prepared meals were presented to the spirits. Animals could also be sacrificed, with their blood considered a sacred gift that strengthened the bond between humans and the unseen world. Such sacrifices were not acts of cruelty in Viking eyes, but expressions of gratitude and exchange. The gods and spirits provided protection. Humans returned honour through offerings. The festival also emphasised fertility in every sense of the word. Healthy children, thriving livestock, productive fields and peaceful households all depended upon maintaining good relationships with supernatural protectors. After surviving another brutal winter, families desperately wanted the coming growing season to succeed. A failed harvest could mean hunger before the next spring arrived. One fascinating connection links Disablot with fate itself. Many scholars believe the Disir shared characteristics with the Norns, the legendary women who wove the destinies of gods and mortals beneath the roots of Yggdrasil. If true, honouring the Disir meant acknowledging that much of life remained beyond human control. Vikings could work tirelessly, build strong ships, and fight bravely in battle, yet fortune still played its unpredictable game. The annual gathering at Uppsala in Sweden eventually became one of the best-known Disablos celebrations. People travelled from across the region not only for religious ceremonies, but also for markets, legal assemblies, and trade. Once again, religion and everyday life merged so completely that separating one from the other became nearly impossible. Disablot reminds us that Viking festivals were never solely about loud drinking halls and heroic warriors. Sometimes they were about family, memory, and quiet gratitude toward the women, both mortal and supernatural, who, in Viking belief, never truly stopped watching over those they loved. With winter finally retreating and patches of green beginning to reclaim the frozen landscape, the Vikings turned their attention toward a festival filled with optimism. It was called Sigrablot, literally meaning victory sacrifice. At first glance, that name sounds entirely devoted to warfare, and certainly many warriors hoped it would bring success in battle. But victory meant much more than defeating enemies. For farmers, victory meant healthy crops. For sailors, it meant surviving another voyage. For traders, it meant returning home with full cargo holds instead of becoming an interesting story someone else told. Spring was the season of beginnings. Long ships that had spent months resting on shore were repaired and dragged back into the water. Fields were ploughed, seeds planted, livestock released from their winter shelters, and communities prepared for the busiest months of the year. After enduring months of darkness, Scandinavia seemed to wake all at once. Sigrablot was held around this moment of renewal, asking the gods to bless everything that lay ahead. Naturally, Odin received plenty of attention. As the god of wisdom, poetry, and war, he was the obvious choice for ambitious chieftains planning summer raids across the North Sea. Warriors offered sacrifices in hopes that the Allfather might grant courage, clever strategy, and perhaps the good fortune of surviving long enough to enjoy the spoils afterward. Viking confidence was admirable, but they also understood that confidence alone rarely stopped an incoming spear. Thor also occupied a central place during the festival. Although remembered today as the mighty thunder god, Thor was equally important to ordinary farmers. His storms brought rain to the fields, and his strength protected both people and crops from destructive forces. A prosperous harvest depended just as much on favourable weather as on hard work. Freya's blessings remained equally essential. As the god of fertility, peace and abundance, He represented everything a farming society desired. Healthy animals, growing grain, and flourishing families all fell within his domain. A successful planting season began with honouring the deity responsible for making seeds actually become food, rather than expensive bird feed. Like nearly every Norse celebration, Sigrblot revolved around communal feasting. Animals were sacrificed, meals shared, and ale flowed generously through the gathering halls. These were not random parties thrown simply because the weather improved. Every shared meal reinforced alliances between families, villages, and local leaders before the demanding months ahead. The chieftain usually hosted much of the celebration, demonstrating his generosity by feeding large numbers of people. Hospitality carried political value. A leader who provided abundant food and drink inspired loyalty far more effectively than one who merely gave speeches about future prosperity. Vikings generally preferred roasted lamb to motivational lectures. Weapons often featured prominently during Sigrblot. Spears, swords, shields, and axes might be blessed before campaigns began. Some warriors dedicated their weapons to Odin, believing divine favour could make the difference between returning home with treasure or becoming part of someone else's heroic saga. There was also an unmistakable sense of hope surrounding the festival. Winter had tested everyone. Supplies had grown thin. Families had worried about disease, livestock, and simple survival. Sigrblot marked the moment when those anxieties finally gave way to possibility. Ships would sail again. Markets would reopen. Children would play outside instead of huddling around smoky hearth fires. For the Vikings, spring was never guaranteed. It had to be welcomed properly, celebrated enthusiastically, and entrusted to the gods. Sigrblot became their declaration that another year of opportunity had begun, and with enough courage, favourable winds, and perhaps a little divine assistance, victory could take many different forms. If Joel celebrated surviving the darkest days of the year, Midsummer celebrated the exact opposite. Now the sun seemed almost unwilling to leave. In much of Scandinavia, daylight stretched so long that sunset barely counted as an event. The nights became little more than an extended twilight, and for people who had endured months of bitter darkness, it must have felt as though the gods themselves had decided to apologize. Although medieval sources describe midsummer less thoroughly than festivals like Joel, historians agree that the summer solstice held deep importance across Scandinavia. Long before Christianity reached the north, people marked the longest day of the year with feasts, fires, and ceremonies celebrating nature at its absolute peak. The timing could not have been better. Fields were green, forests overflowed with life, livestock grazed on rich pastures, and the seas had become far more forgiving than during the violent storms of winter. Trade routes buzzed with activity, fishing flourished, and Viking ships sailed toward Britain, Ireland, the Baltic, and beyond. Summer represented abundance in nearly every form. Naturally, people celebrated. Communities gathered outdoors whenever possible. Unlike winter festivals that packed everyone into smoky longhouses, midsummer encouraged open spaces. Hillsides, meadows, lake shores, and sacred groves became places of gathering. Music echoed through the countryside as storytellers entertained crowds, children played games, and merchants exchanged goods brought from distant settlements. Large bonfires almost certainly played an important role. Fire carried symbolic power throughout Northern Europe. It represented purification, protection, and the strength of the returning sun. Some communities believed flames could drive away harmful spirits, disease, or bad luck before the second half of the year began. Others simply appreciated having an excuse to build an enormous fire. Human beings have remained remarkably consistent on that point. food reflected the season's generosity. Fresh dairy products appeared alongside smoked meats, newly caught fish, bread, berries, herbs, and plenty of ale. Compared with the carefully rationed meals of winter, summer feasts felt almost luxurious. For once, eating generously did not threaten the family's survival several months later. Fertility remained another central theme. Crops still required favourable weather before harvest, and livestock needed to remain healthy throughout the summer. Couples hoping for children may have participated in rituals asking Freya and Freya for blessings. Young people also found festivals particularly convenient for meeting potential spouses. It turns out dancing, music, and unlimited food have been surprisingly effective social icebreakers for over 1,000 years. The endless daylight also inspired something close to awe. Imagine standing outside at midnight, while the horizon still glows with soft golden light. For Vikings, who closely observed nature's rhythms, such moments reinforced the idea that the world itself possessed sacred order. The sun's annual journey was not merely an astronomical event. It reflected the balance maintained by gods and fate. When Christianity spread across Scandinavia, many midsummer traditions survived by attaching themselves to the feast of St. John the Baptist. Bonfires continued to burn. Communities still gathered outdoors. Songs, dancing, and shared meals remained stubbornly popular. Changing the name proved considerably easier than persuading people to abandon a festival they genuinely enjoyed. For the Vikings, midsummer was more than a pleasant holiday. It was a celebration of life at its fullest, a brief season when the earth seemed endlessly generous, the sun barely slept, and even the harsh northern world paused long enough to remind everyone why surviving winter had been worth the effort. Not every Viking festival filled great halls with hundreds of guests, or echoed across the countryside with drinking songs. Some celebrations were so private that outsiders were actively turned away. Among the most mysterious of them all was Alfablot, the sacrifice to the elves, a ceremony wrapped in enough secrecy that even medieval writers struggled to describe it. Unlike Jol or Sigrblot, Alfablot was not a community-wide event. It belonged to individual households. Families gathered quietly on their own farms, closed their doors, and carried out rituals hidden from curious eyes. Travellers who happened to arrive during the festival often found themselves politely, or not so politely, refused hospitality. For the Vikings, that was extraordinary. Hospitality ranked among the greatest social obligations in Norse society. Refusing shelter to a weary traveller was generally frowned upon, unless you had an exceptionally good reason. Alfablot apparently qualified. The rituals were considered too sacred, too personal, or perhaps too dangerous to share with strangers. The recipients of these offerings were the elves, or Alfar. Modern fantasy has given us graceful archers with pointed ears who spend their free time living in elegant forests. The Viking understanding was considerably stranger. No one knows exactly what the Alfar were. Some scholars believe they represented nature spirits connected with fertility and the land itself. Others argue they were the spirits of honoured ancestors who continued watching over their descendants after death. Still others think the elves occupied a unique place, somewhere between gods and humans, powerful enough to influence daily life but far closer to ordinary people than Odin or Thor ever were. The Vikings themselves probably saw no contradiction in these ideas. Norse religion rarely insisted upon neat categories. The supernatural world resembled an enormous extended family, where everyone seemed vaguely related. Nobody fully understood the relationships, and asking too many questions probably invited unnecessary trouble. Offerings during Alfablot likely included food, ale, and the blood of sacrificed animals. These gifts sought the goodwill of the unseen beings believed to inhabit the farm, nearby hills, forests, or ancient burial mounds. Maintaining peaceful relations with such spirits mattered greatly. A displeased elf might bring failed crops, sick livestock, or persistent misfortune. A satisfied one could ensure prosperity throughout the coming year. Timing also played an important role. Most historians believe Alpha Blot took place during late autumn, after the harvest had been gathered, but before winter tightened its grip. The fields lay quiet, the work of the growing season had ended, and families finally had time to focus on spiritual matters rather than simply surviving another exhausting day. The connection between elves and ancestors becomes especially interesting when considering Viking burial customs. Many important families buried their dead close to their farms. The boundary between the living household and those who had gone before remained surprisingly thin. Honouring the Alfar may have meant honouring generations of relatives whose protection was still considered active. One of the few written references comes from the Icelandic poet Sigvat Thordarson in the early 11th century. While travelling through Sweden after Christianity had begun spreading, he repeatedly sought lodging during Alpha Blot. Farm after farm refused him entry, explaining that sacred rites were taking place inside. Even a respected visitor had to continue down the road. That small story tells us something remarkable. This was not a public spectacle meant to impress neighbours or strengthen political alliances. It was deeply personal. Families gathered together, shut out the outside world, and quietly thanked the unseen forces they believed had protected their home. In a society famous for fearless raiders and roaring feasts, Alpha Blot reveals another side of the Vikings, one that valued silence, tradition, and the comforting belief that invisible friends, or perhaps invisible ancestors, still lingered just beyond the firelight, watching over the family through another long northern winter. By the time autumn arrived, the Vikings knew one simple truth. Whatever had not been harvested by now probably never would be. The days grew shorter almost by the hour, the nights turned colder, and the forests exchanged their green crowns for shades of gold and crimson. This was the season of Haustblot, the autumn sacrifice, a festival that balanced celebration with caution. The harvest was in, but winter was already visible on the horizon, quietly sharpening its teeth. Haustblot was one of the year's most practical religious festivals. Unlike the optimism of spring or the endless daylight of midsummer, autumn demanded realism. Families took stock of their grain stores, counted their livestock, salted meat, smoked fish, collected firewood, repaired roofs, and hoped they had estimated correctly how much food would be needed until spring. Imagine waking before sunrise to the sound of a Roman bugle echoing across misty hills instead of the bustling streets of Rome. You open your door, and rather than marble temples or crowded forums, you see timber houses, muddy roads, grazing cattle, and a massive stone fort filled with soldiers from every corner of the empire. Welcome to Rome's northern frontier, where love, marriage, and family unfolded in one of the most fascinating melting pots of the ancient world. The northern frontier stretched across Britain, the Rhine, and the Danube, marking the uneasy boundary between Roman civilization and the peoples the empire politely referred to as barbarians. In reality, life here was far less divided than Roman politicians like to imagine. Beyond the forts lived Britons, Germans, Gauls, and countless tribal communities. Inside the forts served men from Spain, Syria, North Africa, Thrace, and Italy. Why? A single marketplace could contain half a dozen languages before breakfast. Unlike Rome itself, where traditions had centuries to settle into neat routines, frontier life constantly evolved. Cultures mixed every day. Roman soldiers bought food from local farmers. Tribal craftsmen repaired Roman equipment. Merchants carried wine north and amber south. Children grew up hearing Latin at the military gates and Celtic or Germanic dialects at home. It was less a sharp border and more a very long neighbourhood, with occasional disagreements involving spears. Marriage reflected this blending of worlds. Official Roman law often struggled to keep pace with everyday reality. Soldiers spent decades stationed hundreds of miles from Italy, surrounded by local communities. Merchants settled permanently in frontier towns. Craftsmen built businesses beside military camps. People met, fell in love, started families, and generally ignored the fact that bureaucrats back in Rome occasionally disapproved of their decisions. The settlements surrounding Roman forts became lively communities in their own right. Known today as vici, these civilian villages housed blacksmiths, potters, innkeepers, traders, laundresses, and countless families whose livelihoods depended on the nearby garrison. They were places where Roman customs blended naturally with local traditions. A wedding feast might include imported Mediterranean wine served alongside local ale, while guests wore Roman brooches over cloaks woven in traditional tribal styles. Life on the frontier demanded practicality above all else. Winters could be brutal. Roads turned into rivers of mud, and news from Rome sometimes arrived months late, assuming it arrived at all. Under such conditions, choosing a spouse involved far more than romance. Marriage created partnerships that helped people survive. A reliable husband or wife meant another pair of hands during harvest, someone to manage the household during military campaigns, and a family network capable of enduring uncertain times. Yet, despite the hardships, the frontier offered opportunities unavailable elsewhere in the empire. Here, social boundaries often became surprisingly flexible. Roman citizens married local women. Tribal leaders formed alliances with Roman officials. Children inherited traditions from both parents, creating entirely new identities that belonged neither wholly to Rome nor entirely to the tribes beyond its borders. So while emperors in distant palaces debated the fate of the empire, ordinary people along its northern edge were quietly building something far more lasting. Families that proved love could cross borders far more easily than any Roman legion ever could. Now that you've settled into life on the empire's northern edge, another question quickly emerges. How did people actually find someone to marry in a place built around military forts, muddy roads, and enough cultural differences to make even simple greetings occasionally awkward? The answer is surprisingly ordinary. Despite the image of the frontier as a bleak military outpost, it was full of life. Roman forts attracted people the way modern cities attract businesses. Wherever thousands of soldiers settled, opportunities followed. Traders arrived with carts full of wine, olive oil, pottery and cloth. Blacksmiths opened workshops, bakers built ovens, farmers supplied grain and livestock, innkeepers welcomed travellers, while children filled the streets, chasing one another between market stalls. Naturally, young men and women met one another. Markets became some of the busiest social spaces on the frontier. Families travelled from nearby villages to sell livestock, wool, vegetables, or handmade goods. Roman merchants bargained with tribal farmers, soldiers wandered through the stalls during their free hours, and conversations began over something as simple as purchasing a loaf of bread or a new pair of boots. Love stories have started for stranger reasons. Religious festivals also created opportunities. Roman temples stood alongside sacred groves and local shrines, and both attracted large crowds during important celebrations. Music, feasting, athletic competitions, and religious ceremonies brought together people who might otherwise spend months living miles apart. Parents certainly noticed eligible sons and daughters, although the young participants probably preferred to believe they were making their own decisions. Family remained deeply involved in choosing a spouse. Among both Romans and many northern tribes, marriage was rarely viewed as purely an individual affair. It connected households, strengthened alliances, secured property, and expanded networks of mutual support. Parents offered advice, relatives made introductions, and village elders sometimes helped negotiate arrangements. Romantic love existed, but practical considerations usually received an equal vote. One fascinating aspect of frontier life involved Roman soldiers themselves. For much of the early empire, ordinary legionaries were officially forbidden from contracting legal marriages during active service. Roman authorities believed soldiers fought more effectively if they remained free from family obligations. It was a policy that looked sensible on parchment in Rome, but considerably less convincing after 25 years stationed beside Hadrian's Wall. Reality ignored the law. Many soldiers formed long-term relationships with local women anyway. These unofficial partners lived in the civilian settlements outside the forts, raising children and managing households, while their companions served inside the walls. Tombstones discovered across Britain and the Rhine tell remarkably personal stories of these families. Inscriptions lovingly mention wives, companions, daughters, and sons, even when Roman law refused to recognize every relationship formally. Everything changed during the reign of Emperor Septimius Severus in the early 3rd century. He finally permitted soldiers to marry legally while serving, acknowledging what had long been obvious. Thousands of military families already existed. The law had simply spent decades pretending otherwise. Mixed marriages became increasingly common. A cavalryman from Spain might marry a British woman. An auxiliary soldier recruited from Batavia could settle with a local German family. Merchants from Gaul established households with Celtic or Romano-British partners. Children born from these unions often grew up speaking Latin alongside local languages, celebrating Roman festivals while preserving tribal traditions at home. On Rome's northern frontier, marriage was rarely about choosing between two cultures. More often, it meant learning to live comfortably within both. Every new family quietly stitched another thread into the rich and complicated fabric of frontier society, proving that shared lives often crossed borders far more easily than imperial laws ever managed. Once a couple had decided to marry, or more accurately, once their families agreed that it was an excellent idea, the real celebration could begin. On Rome's northern frontier, however, no two weddings looked exactly alike. Roman customs met tribal traditions, local beliefs blended with imperial law, and every ceremony reflected the unique mix of cultures that defined life along the empire's edge. If both families were Roman citizens, the ceremony generally followed familiar Roman traditions. The bride wore a long white tunic, often secured with a special knot known as the nodus Herculeus, symbolizing fidelity and strength. A bright orange veil, called the flammium, covered her hair, making her instantly recognizable as a bride. Considering the weather in northern Britain, that veil probably doubled as protection against a cold wind, though Roman writers neglected to mention this practical benefit. The wedding itself was less about grand romance than about creating a lawful household. Witnesses gathered, vows were exchanged, sacrifices were offered to household gods, and a feast followed. Unlike modern ceremonies with lengthy speeches and carefully choreographed dances, Roman weddings emphasized legal agreement, family honor, and public recognition. But on the frontier, life was rarely that straightforward. Many marriages united Roman settlers with local Britons, Germans, or Celtic families. In those cases, traditions often blended naturally. A bride might wear Roman jewellery while dressing in a beautifully woven tribal cloak fastened with an ornate bronze brooch. The groom could arrive wearing a Roman military belt beneath a locally made woolen mantle. Rather than replacing one culture with another, families frequently combined both. Feasting remained the universal language everyone understood. Roasted pork, beef, venison, fresh bread, cheese, apples, honey, and locally brewed ale filled the tables, while wealthier households added imported Roman wine, olives, dried figs, and expensive spices brought from astonishing distances. Imagine sipping wine grown in southern Italy while standing only a few miles from Hadrian's Wall. The Roman trade network had an impressive ability to confuse geography. Music echoed through the celebrations as well. Roman flutes and horns mixed with local drums, stringed instruments, and traditional songs that had likely been passed down for generations. Guests danced, laughed, exchanged gifts, and celebrated long into the evening. Human beings, regardless of century or empire, have always discovered that weddings become considerably louder once enough alcohol appears. Gift-giving carried important symbolism. Roman families often presented furniture, household tools, cooking vessels, clothing, or livestock to help establish the new home. Among many northern tribes, gifts also strengthened alliances between families. Fine weapons, horses, elaborate brooches, amber beads, or silver jewellery demonstrated both generosity and status. These were not merely decorative presents, but investments in the couple's future prosperity. One remarkable feature of frontier weddings was the number of different languages spoken during a single celebration. Latin might dominate official legal matters, while Celtic dialects, early Germanic languages, or even Greek could be heard among guests. Auxiliary soldiers serving Rome came from across the empire, bringing their own customs, accents, and beliefs. A wedding near the frontier could sound remarkably international for the 2nd century. Not every marriage, however, enjoyed full legal recognition. Before Emperor Septimius Severus changed the law, soldiers could not officially marry during active service. Many ceremonies therefore existed in a legal grey area. Communities recognised the couple as husband and wife, children grew up together, neighbours accepted the household. Yet Roman bureaucracy insisted on pretending none of it existed. It was one of those rare occasions when everyday life proved considerably more sensible than official policy. By the end of the celebration, what truly mattered was not whether every ritual followed Roman tradition or tribal custom. The feast had been shared, families united, and another household had begun. On the empire's northern frontier, marriage itself became a symbol of something larger, proof that two very different worlds could build a future together, one wedding at a time. Once the wedding feast ended and the last guest wandered home, perhaps slightly less steadily than when they had arrived, the newly married couple faced the real challenge. Building a life together on Rome's northern frontier required far more than affection. Love was helpful, certainly, but it did not repair leaking roofs, gather firewood, or persuade stubborn sheep to stay where they belonged. The family home reflected the unique world of the frontier itself. Some couples lived inside thriving Roman towns, such as Eboracum, modern York, or Londinium, farther south. Others settled in the bustling civilian villages that surrounded military forts. These settlements, known as vici, had grown almost accidentally. Wherever several hundred soldiers remained for years, civilians naturally followed. Blacksmiths, merchants, bakers, doctors, potters, and families all found opportunities beside the garrison. A typical frontier home depended largely on wealth. Prosperous merchants or retired officers sometimes occupied comfortable stone houses with tiled roofs, heated floors, painted walls, and small private courtyards. Underfloor heating, known as the hypercaust, circulated warm air beneath the floors, an invention that must have seemed almost magical during a freezing British winter. Imagine explaining central heating to a tribal farmer whose house still relied on a smoky hearth. It would have sounded suspiciously like sorcery. Most families, however, lived far more modestly. Their homes combined Roman building techniques with local traditions. Timber walls rested upon stone foundations. Thatched roofs protected simple interiors divided into only a few rooms. The central hearth served multiple purposes at once: cooking meals, heating the house, drying clothing, and filling everything with enough smoke to convince future archaeologists that chimneys were apparently considered an unnecessary luxury. Furniture remained practical rather than elaborate. Wooden beds, stools, benches, storage chests, woven baskets, pottery, and simple tables filled most households. Decorative objects existed, but practicality always came first. Every item had to justify the effort required to make or transport it across hundreds of miles. Marriage also divided responsibilities, though not always as rigidly as people imagine. Women managed much of the household economy. They baked bread, brewed ale, spun wool, wove cloth, prepared food, cared for children, and supervised servants if the family could afford them. Archaeological discoveries suggest many women also participated in trade, owned property, and managed businesses, particularly when husbands travelled or served with the army. Men worked farms, practiced skilled trades, operated workshops, or served in the military. Yet frontier life demanded flexibility. If repairs needed doing, everyone helped. If harvest season arrived, every available hand entered the fields. Survival cared remarkably little for traditional job descriptions. Children quickly became contributors rather than simply dependents. From an early age, they learned practical skills. Boys often accompanied fathers into workshops or farms, while girls learned spinning, weaving, cooking, and household management from mothers and older relatives. Of course, reality frequently ignored these neat divisions. Children learned whatever skills their family required. A frontier household valued competence far more than perfect adherence to social expectations. One fascinating aspect of family life involved language. Around the dinner table, parents might switch effortlessly between Latin and a local Celtic or Germanic dialect. A retired auxiliary soldier from Gaul could marry a British woman, raise children who spoke both languages fluently, and trade daily with merchants from Spain or Syria. Few places in the ancient world matched the frontier's remarkable cultural diversity. Religion reflected this mixture as well. Household shrines often contained Roman gods standing beside local deities. Jupiter might share space with Celtic healing spirits. Mercury could appear alongside tribal protective gods. Rather than choosing one belief system over another, frontier families frequently welcomed both. After all, when raising children beside one of the empire's most unpredictable borders, having extra divine protection seemed like a perfectly sensible precaution. Home, then, became far more than four walls and a roof. It was where Roman customs met local traditions every single day, where children inherited two worlds instead of one, and where ordinary families quietly created a society that belonged fully to neither Rome nor the tribes beyond its borders, but somehow became stronger because of both. A few years after the wedding, your home has become noticeably louder. Small sandals are scattered across the floor. Someone has managed to spill porridge in a place that seems physically impossible, and the family dog has decided this is an excellent opportunity to steal dinner. In other words, life on Rome's northern frontier is progressing exactly as it should. Children stood at the very heart of frontier society. They represented not only the future of a family, but also its survival. Every child meant another pair of hands that would eventually help plough fields, tend livestock, weave cloth, repair buildings, or carry on the family trade. Life expectancy was uncertain, and infant mortality remained tragically common, making every healthy child a source of both joy and cautious hope. The first years of life were often dangerous. Disease spread easily, medicine remained limited, and harsh winters tested even the healthiest families. Parents protected newborns with practical care as well as religious rituals. Small amulets, carved pendants, and protective charms have been discovered across Roman Britain and the German frontier. Whether dedicated to Jupiter, local Celtic gods, or household spirits, these objects reflected the same wish every parent has ever shared. Let this child grow safely into adulthood. As children became older, learning happened naturally through observation rather than formal classrooms. A young boy might spend the morning following his father through a blacksmith's workshop, watching glowing iron transform into nails, horseshoes, or spearheads. Another accompanied his mother to the marketplace, learning how to bargain with merchants who somehow insisted their prices were always the lowest you'll find. Apparently, this sales technique has survived remarkably well for 2,000 years. Girls learned equally valuable skills. They spun wool into thread, helped weave clothing, prepared food, cared for younger siblings, and gradually took on greater responsibilities within the household. Yet archaeology suggests these roles were not entirely rigid. On the frontier, practicality almost always defeated tradition. Everyone learned whatever the family needed most. Many children grew up speaking 2 languages almost without realizing it. Imagine sitting around the evening fire. Your father, a retired cavalryman from Gaul, speaks Latin while telling stories about serving under the emperor. Your mother answers in the local Brittonic language, and your grandmother occasionally interrupts with words neither parent quite pronounces correctly anymore. Before long, you switch effortlessly between both languages depending on who asks you a question. This bilingual childhood became surprisingly common along the frontier. Education itself varied enormously. Wealthier Roman families sometimes hired tutors who taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and classical literature. Children practiced letters by scratching them into wax tablets, and learned enough mathematics to manage business or military administration later in life. Most frontier children, however, received an education built upon experience rather than books. They learned how to recognize changing weather before a storm arrived. They knew which herbs eased a fever, how to repair fences after winter damage, and when livestock needed moving to better pasture. These lessons rarely appeared in Roman philosophy, yet they proved considerably more useful when your roof unexpectedly began leaking in the middle of January. Religion also shaped childhood. Families celebrated Roman festivals, local tribal ceremonies, or often both. A child might attend sacrifices to Jupiter at a Roman temple before joining relatives for traditional Celtic seasonal celebrations. Rather than seeing these beliefs as contradictory, frontier families simply accepted them as different ways of understanding the same unpredictable world. Growing up on Rome's northern frontier meant inheriting 2 identities from birth. These children belonged to the empire, yet they also belonged to the ancient lands beyond it. They spoke multiple languages, followed blended traditions, and lived between cultures so naturally that they rarely questioned it. In many ways, they became something entirely new, a generation that proved the strongest frontier was never the one marked by walls, but the one crossed every day by ordinary families building a shared future. Life on Rome's northern frontier could be deeply rewarding, but it was never easy. The same roads that carried merchants, new neighbours, and wedding processions also carried marching legions, tax collectors, and the occasional alarming report that someone beyond the frontier had decided diplomacy was becoming terribly overrated. Marriage here was not simply about sharing happy moments. It was about enduring uncertainty together, For military families, separation became almost routine. A legion or auxiliary unit could receive orders to patrol the frontier, escort officials, repair roads, or respond to unrest with very little notice. A husband might disappear for weeks or months, leaving his wife to manage the household alone, and she usually did. Archaeological evidence and inscriptions suggest frontier women often ran farms, supervised workshops, collected payments, negotiated with merchants, and raised children while their husbands served elsewhere. They were far more than passive companions waiting patiently by the door. Without them, many frontier communities simply could not have functioned. Letters discovered at Vindolanda, just south of Hadrian's Wall, offer remarkable glimpses into this world. Written on thin wooden tablets nearly 2,000 years ago, they preserve everyday conversations between officers, merchants, wives, and friends. One famous letter, written by Claudia Severa to Sulpicia Lepidina, warmly invites her to a birthday celebration. It is one of the earliest surviving examples of writing by a woman in Latin. The invitation itself sounds wonderfully ordinary. There are no dramatic speeches about the empire or glorious military victories. Instead, one woman simply hopes another will come celebrate her birthday. It reminds us that behind every fort and frontier stood people whose greatest concern that week might simply have been whether enough guests would attend dinner. Of course, not every absence ended happily. Disease remained one of the greatest threats. Dysentery, pneumonia, infections, and countless illnesses spread easily through crowded settlements. Roman medicine could treat wounds surprisingly well, but invisible bacteria remained stubbornly unimpressed by medical confidence. Accidents claimed lives as well. Farmers were injured by livestock. Craftsmen worked with dangerous tools. Soldiers trained with heavy weapons every day. Even travelling carried risks. Roads became muddy, rivers flooded, and bandits occasionally decided someone else's belongings looked more appealing than earning their own. Then there was war. Although Hadrian's Wall projected an image of permanent security, the frontier rarely stayed completely peaceful. Raids occurred. Rebellions erupted. Tribal confederations tested Roman defences. Entire communities occasionally found themselves caught between two worlds, uncertain which side would emerge victorious. De-emergency supplies. Others strengthened homes or temporarily moved closer to larger forts during periods of unrest. Children grew accustomed to seeing soldiers march through nearby villages, while wives quietly wondered whether familiar faces would eventually return. Before you can become one of the most feared bodyguards in the medieval world, you first have to make a decision that sounds either incredibly brave or spectacularly reckless. You are going to leave home, not for a neighbouring village, nor for another kingdom across the sea, but for a city so rich, so enormous, and so distant that many people in Scandinavia have only heard stories about it. Its name is Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, where the emperor himself is looking for warriors willing to guard his life. You are not alone. Beginning in the late 9th century and continuing for hundreds of years, thousands of Norsemen made the long journey east. They came from Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, and later even from England after the Norman conquest of 1066. Anglo-Saxon nobles and warriors who had lost everything to William the Conqueror found a second chance in the emperor's service, standing shoulder to shoulder with descendants of the very Vikings who had once raided their homeland. History has an excellent sense of irony. Why would anyone leave the familiar fjords and forests of the north? Part of the answer was wealth. The Byzantine Empire was the richest state in Europe. While many Scandinavian farmers measured prosperity by the number of sheep or cattle they owned, Constantinople measured it in gold coins. Real gold coins, not promises, not livestock, not sacks of grain, but beautifully minted solidi and later numismata that were accepted throughout the Mediterranean. A successful Varangian could earn more in a few years than many families back home might accumulate over generations. Adventure also played its part. Young men who had grown up listening to sagas about distant lands did not dream of spending every day repairing fences or arguing over whose goats had wandered into whose field. The East promised bustling cities, exotic markets, magnificent churches, and battles worthy of being remembered. Besides, after surviving a Scandinavian winter, almost anywhere else sounded pleasantly inviting. The journey itself, however, was anything but easy. Most recruits travelled through Sweden before entering the great river systems of Eastern Europe. From there they followed famous trade routes used by the Russ merchants, navigating the Volkhov, Dnieper, and other rivers that linked the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Their ships had to be dragged over land between waterways during difficult portages, a process involving enormous effort, plenty of mud, and almost certainly several colourful complaints that history politely forgot to record. The dangers never stopped. Bandits lurked along the riverbanks. Hostile tribes controlled certain territories. Rapids could smash boats against hidden rocks, while disease, hunger, and exhaustion accompanied travellers every step of the way. Some recruits never reached Constantinople at all, disappearing somewhere along the endless waterways that connected northern Europe with the Byzantine world. Then, after months of travel, the city finally appeared. Nothing in Scandinavia could prepare you for Constantinople. Its colossal walls stretched across the landscape like mountains built by human hands. Golden church domes shimmered beneath the sun. Hundreds of ships crowded its harbours, carrying goods from Egypt, Arabia, Italy, Armenia, and lands you had probably never heard of. The streets overflowed with merchants speaking dozens of languages, while spices, silk, incense, and perfumes filled the air with unfamiliar scents. For a young Viking arriving from the forests of the north, Constantinople must have felt less like another city and more like another planet. And somewhere behind those immense walls waited the emperor himself, the ruler who was about to entrust complete strangers from the edge of Europe with the most important duty in his entire empire, protecting his own life. After months of rivers, storms, aching muscles, suspicious innkeepers, and enough mosquitoes to convince you nature held a personal grudge, you finally stand inside the greatest city in Europe. But simply arriving in Constantinople does not make you a Varangian. Plenty of foreigners reach the city hoping to earn their fortune. Only a select few would be trusted with guarding the most powerful man in the Christian world. The Byzantine emperor did not need more soldiers. He already commanded professional armies spread across 3 continents. He had generals, palace guards, elite cavalry, and thousands of experienced troops. What he needed was something much rarer, someone he could trust. That may sound surprising. Why would a Byzantine emperor trust a foreign Viking more than one of his own subjects? The answer lies in Byzantine politics, which were every bit as dangerous as the empire's enemies. Constantinople was magnificent, but it was also a city overflowing with ambitious nobles, influential generals, wealthy families, and court officials who constantly competed for power. Emperors were occasionally overthrown, imprisoned, blinded, or quietly removed from history by people who had sworn absolute loyalty only a few weeks earlier. Working at the imperial court was rather like living inside a beautifully decorated nest of snakes. Foreign warriors offered something unique. They had no powerful relatives in Constantinople. They owned no estates in the empire. They belonged to no political faction, supported no rival noble family, and had no interest in palace conspiracies. Their future depended entirely upon the emperor who employed them. If he remained on the throne, they remained wealthy. If he fell, so did their fortunes. loyalty suddenly became very simple. Before entering the guard, every recruit swore a solemn oath directly to the emperor himself. This was no casual promise exchanged over a cup of ale. Oaths carried enormous weight in both Viking and Byzantine cultures. For a Norse warrior, breaking an oath brought lasting dishonour. A man's reputation often survived longer than his body, and being remembered as an oath-breaker was one of the worst legacies imaginable. The Byzantines understood this remarkably well. They recognised that these northern warriors considered personal loyalty almost sacred. Once sworn, your allegiance belonged to the emperor alone, not to a general, not to a governor, not even to another member of the imperial family. If rival princes fought over the throne, your duty remained protecting the reigning emperor until lawful authority changed. The Varangians earned a reputation for standing beside their master, even when entire Byzantine armies changed sides. More than once, they fought almost to the last man, defending an emperor whose own subjects had already abandoned him. The oath also marked a personal transformation. You were no longer simply a Viking seeking adventure or wealth. You had become part of one of the Empire's most prestigious military institutions. Veterans welcomed new recruits into a brotherhood whose members came from Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, Kievan Rus, and, in later centuries, Anglo-Saxon England. Around the barracks, you heard a remarkable mixture of languages. Old Norse echoed alongside Greek, Latin, and Slavic dialects. Some recruits had spent years trading along the rivers of Eastern Europe. Others had crossed the sea for the first time only months earlier. Their backgrounds differed, but every man had made the same extraordinary promise. Perhaps the greatest irony of all was this: the Byzantine emperor surrounded himself with men whose grandfathers might have terrified Europe's coastlines as Viking raiders. Yet inside Constantinople's palace, those same northern warriors became the very symbol of unwavering loyalty. The emperor did not trust them because they were Vikings. He trusted them because they belonged to no one else. Now that you have sworn your oath, the emperor considers you loyal. That does not necessarily mean he considers you competent. There is an important difference. Many new arrivals already had years of fighting experience. Some had raided across the North Sea, others had battled rival Scandinavian kings, while many from the lands of the Rus had spent their youth protecting merchant caravans along dangerous river routes. They knew how to swing an axe, survive harsh weather, and remain standing after a fight that sensible people would have avoided entirely. The Byzantines appreciated those qualities. They also intended to improve them. The first lesson was surprisingly simple: stop fighting like an individual hero. Traditional Viking warfare celebrated personal courage. A warrior earned glory by charging forward, seeking worthy opponents, and proving his reputation in battle. Byzantine commanders admired bravery, but they valued discipline even more. A soldier who ignored orders to chase personal glory was not considered heroic. He was considered a problem waiting to happen. So training began with formations. Hour after hour, recruits learned to move together instead of alone. Lines advanced, halted, wheeled, and reformed on command until every movement became instinctive. The Empire had survived for centuries because its armies relied upon coordination rather than spontaneous acts of heroism. One disciplined unit could often defeat a much larger force that fought as individuals. Then came the weapon everyone associated with the Varangian Guard, the famous Danish axe. Its long wooden shaft often reached nearly the height of the man carrying it, while its broad blade could split shields, helmets, and occasionally the confidence of anyone standing in the wrong place. Contemporary writers frequently describe the Varangians carving paths through enemy formations with these enormous weapons. Using one effectively, however, demanded far more than raw strength. The axe was surprisingly balanced, requiring careful footwork and timing. Swing too early, and your opponent stepped aside. Swing too late, and someone else introduced you to the unpleasant end of a spear. Veteran instructors drilled recruits endlessly, correcting stance, grip, and movement, until every strike flowed naturally into the next. Of course, the axe was not the only weapon. Varangians also trained with swords, spears, daggers, and shields. Archery received less emphasis than among some Byzantine troops, but every guardsman needed to understand multiple weapons. Battlefield conditions changed quickly, and surviving often depended upon adapting faster than your opponent. Training extended well beyond combat. Unlike ordinary soldiers, the Varangian Guard spent much of its time protecting the emperor himself. That meant learning palace security, escort procedures, ceremonial formations, and how to remain perfectly alert during hours of standing guard. This last skill proved harder than it sounded. Imagine remaining absolutely motionless while wearing heavy armour, holding a massive axe, surrounded by glittering marble halls, and resisting the urge to scratch your nose for 3 consecutive hours. It required a level of self-control that no saga writer ever thought worth celebrating. The recruits also had to learn Byzantine military customs. Commands were often given in Greek, requiring foreign warriors to memorize essential vocabulary. They studied ranks, signals, battle standards, and the complex organization of the imperial army. No one expected a Norseman to become a philosopher overnight, but understanding orders before the battle started generally improved one's chances of surviving it. Veteran Varangians played an essential role in this transformation. Many had served for decades, fighting in Italy, Anatolia, Syria, and the Balkans. Their bodies carried scars earned against Bulgarians, Arabs, Normans, and rebellious Byzantine generals alike. They taught younger recruits lessons that no manual could provide: when to conserve strength, how to recognize an ambush, and why confidence should never be confused with carelessness. Slowly, almost without noticing, you began to change. You still carried the courage of a Viking, the determination of a northerner, and the instincts that had brought you safely across half of Europe. But now those qualities were sharpened by Byzantine discipline. You were no longer simply a foreign warrior seeking fortune. You were becoming exactly what the emperor needed: a guardsman capable of standing perfectly still in the palace, then charging fearlessly into battle the very next day. Few soldiers in the medieval world were expected to master both. Fewer still ever did. After weeks of training, bruises, and enough shouted Greek commands to make your head spin, you finally receive the assignment every recruit has imagined since arriving in Constantinople. You are going to serve inside the Great Palace. This is no ordinary military barracks. The Great Palace is the beating heart of the Byzantine Empire, a vast complex overlooking the Bosporus, where emperors govern millions of subjects stretching from Italy to the borders of Armenia. It contains throne rooms, chapels, gardens, libraries, audience halls, private apartments, treasuries, workshops, and enough corridors to ensure that getting lost becomes a perfectly respectable career choice. For someone raised in a Scandinavian longhouse, the first impression borders on overwhelming. Marble floors gleam beneath your boots. Walls shimmer with mosaics made from tiny pieces of coloured glass and gold. High ceilings disappear into elaborate domes, while fountains quietly flow through peaceful courtyards filled with exotic plants brought from distant provinces. Silk curtains hang where rough wool would have been considered luxurious back home. The palace does not simply display wealth, it is designed to impress everyone who enters. Foreign ambassadors from the Holy Roman Empire, the Caliphate, Kievan Rus, and countless other kingdoms walk through these halls before meeting the emperor. Every polished stone, every golden chandelier, every carefully choreographed ceremony reminds visitors that they stand before one of the richest and oldest empires on earth. Your job is to ensure nothing interrupts that illusion. The Varangian Guard protects every important entrance. You stand outside the emperor's private chambers, accompany him during official ceremonies, watch over the imperial treasury, and guard strategic points throughout the palace. Every visitor passes beneath the silent gaze of towering northern warriors carrying enormous axes. The choice of weapon is hardly accidental. Most palace guards across Europe carry spears or swords. The Varangians carry two-handed axes that immediately capture everyone's attention. Their polished blades reflect the palace lights, while their sheer size quietly suggests that causing trouble would be an exceptionally poor decision. Interestingly, much of your day involves standing beside doors, standing beside staircases, standing beside the throne, standing beside corridors that appear perfectly empty until someone very important suddenly decides to walk through them. It sounds simple, but it demands constant concentration. Palace assassinations were not exactly unknown in Byzantine history. A smiling court official could become a conspirator overnight, and a harmless-looking visitor might conceal a dagger beneath expensive robes. Your task is to notice danger before anyone else does. The emperor himself follows an astonishingly structured daily routine. Court ceremonies begin early. Officials present reports from distant provinces. Generals discuss military campaigns. Judges hear legal appeals. Ambassadors deliver gifts and negotiate treaties. Religious ceremonies occupy an equally important place, with the emperor attending services inside magnificent churches, accompanied by an elaborate procession. Wherever he goes, the Varangians go too. They march beside him in disciplined formation, towering above most members of the court. Contemporary Byzantine writers frequently describe the guard as physically imposing, their fair hair and massive axes making them instantly recognizable among the richly dressed officials surrounding the emperor. Yet, life inside the palace is not entirely rigid. Between duties, you share meals with fellow guardsmen drawn from every corner of northern Europe. Stories circulate constantly. Veterans speak about campaigns in Sicily, battles against the Bulgarians, or narrow escapes in the mountains of Anatolia. New recruits listen carefully, trying to separate genuine military wisdom from tales that have grown slightly more impressive after several cups of wine. There is also another challenge: learning palace etiquette. In Scandinavia, greeting a king might involve a respectful nod and direct conversation. In Constantinople, protocol governs almost every movement. There are proper ways to bow, proper moments to speak, proper routes through the palace, and proper distances from the emperor himself. Accidentally violating court etiquette will not usually cost your life, but it may earn disapproving looks capable of making even seasoned generals uncomfortable. Slowly, the palace becomes familiar. The endless corridors no longer seem confusing. The ceremonies become routine. The glittering mosaics lose some of their ability to astonish. Yet one fact never changes. Every night, while the emperor sleeps behind guarded doors, it is you, a warrior from the cold forests of the north, who stands between the ruler of the Byzantine Empire and anyone foolish enough to threaten him. Guarding the emperor's palace is an immense honour. It is also, at times, surprisingly uneventful. There are only so many hours you can spend watching diplomats bow, servants hurry through corridors, and officials argue over matters that somehow require 6 meetings instead of 1. Then the order arrives. The emperor is going to war. Suddenly, the polished marble floors of the great palace are replaced by dusty military roads stretching across mountains, forests, and endless plains. Your magnificent ceremonial axe is no longer intended to impress foreign ambassadors. It is about to meet enemy shields. The Varangian Guard was never simply a decorative palace unit. Despite their reputation as imperial bodyguards, they regularly accompanied Byzantine emperors on military campaigns. Wherever the ruler went, his most trusted warriors followed. If the emperor rode into battle, the Varangians formed the steel wall around him. And they fought. By the 10th and 11th centuries, the Byzantine Empire faced enemies in almost every direction. To the east stood Arab armies, and later the Seljuk Turks. In the Balkans, Bulgarian rulers challenged imperial authority. In southern Italy and Sicily, ambitious Norman knights carved out new kingdoms. Occasionally, the greatest threat came from inside the empire itself, where rebellious generals decided they preferred wearing the imperial crown rather than merely saluting it. The Varangian Guard found itself fighting all of them. Unlike many Byzantine units, which specialized in cavalry, archery, or skirmishing, the Varangians excelled as heavy infantry. Their task was brutally straightforward: break the enemy where resistance was strongest. Imagine standing shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of fellow guardsmen, each carrying a towering Danish axe. Across the field waits an enemy shield wall. The signal sounds. Slowly at first, then with increasing speed, your line advances. When the two formations collide, the Varangians unleash the full power of their weapons. Their enormous axes were capable of smashing through shields, helmets, and even the long spears that opposing infantry relied upon. Contemporary chroniclers frequently described the guard cutting wide gaps into enemy formations, allowing the rest of the Byzantine army to exploit the opening. Of course, the weapon alone did not guarantee victory. Success depended upon discipline. A recruit who rushed ahead seeking personal glory endangered everyone beside him. Veterans constantly reminded younger warriors that surviving the battle mattered considerably more than becoming the subject of an impressive funeral speech. One campaign after another strengthened the Guard's reputation. During the reign of Emperor Basil II, often called the Bulgar Slayer, the Varangians fought in the long wars against the Bulgarian Empire. Basil valued disciplined troops above almost everything else, and the Northern Guardsmen repeatedly proved worthy of his confidence. They also served in Italy, where Byzantine armies clashed with Norman adventurers such as Robert Guiscard. Ironically, many Normans shared distant Viking ancestry with the Varangians. On more than one battlefield, descendants of the northern raiders fought one another beneath Mediterranean sunshine, probably wondering how their ancestors would have reacted to such an unlikely reunion. Perhaps the Guard's most famous battle came in 1066 at Hastings. Not because they fought there, but because that battle transformed the Guard forever. After William the Conqueror defeated King Harold II of England, many surviving Anglo-Saxon nobles refused to serve the new Norman king. Instead, they sailed east to Constantinople, where they joined the Varangian Guard in large numbers. Before long, English became almost as common as Old Norse within the ranks. The emperor hardly objected. Whether a warrior came from Norway, Denmark, Sweden, or England mattered far less than one simple question. Would he stand his ground when everything else fell apart? Time after time, the answer was yes. On battlefields from the mountains of Anatolia to the shores of Sicily, the Varangian Guard earned a reputation that spread across Europe and the Middle East. They were not known for elaborate tactics or political ambition. They became famous for something much simpler and infinitely more valuable. When the fighting became desperate, the emperor sent in the men with the axes. And more often than not, they delivered exactly what he expected. After surviving your first campaign, something changes. The older guardsmen stop calling you the new recruit. You know where to stand during inspections, how to march in perfect formation through Constantinople's crowded streets, and perhaps most importantly, how to avoid embarrassing yourself in front of the emperor. Congratulations, you are finally becoming a true Varangian. But military skill alone is not what keeps men in the guard for years or even decades. The answer is surprisingly simple: the pay. Serving in the Varangian Guard was one of the most lucrative military careers available anywhere in medieval Europe. While an ordinary farmer back in Norway might spend an entire year hoping for a decent harvest, you were receiving regular wages in Byzantine gold. Real gold. Coins so pure and reliable that merchants from Spain to Persia gladly accepted them without hesitation. Many Varangians had never handled such wealth before arriving in Constantinople. Their salary alone was impressive, but it rarely stopped there. Successful campaigns often brought generous bonuses. Victorious emperors rewarded loyal soldiers with extra payments, expensive clothing, silver drinking cups, jewellery, fine weapons, horses, and sometimes parcels of land. Every military triumph could mean another fortune added to your purse. Then there was the privilege every Varangian quietly hoped would one day become relevant. Whenever an emperor died naturally, tradition allowed members of the guard to enter the imperial palace before almost anyone else, and claim certain movable valuables as part of their reward. Byzantine writers referred to this remarkable custom as the pollutersvarf, a word of Old Norse origin, meaning something close to palace plunder. Before you imagine the guards sprinting through the corridors stuffing golden statues into sacks, the reality was rather more organised. The privilege followed established rules, and it only applied after the emperor's death, not after a convenient misunderstanding involving an axe. The Byzantines were many things, but they generally preferred their emperors alive until fate decided otherwise.